Thanks for that, Stephen Peter, joining us from Ginger Town. Momentous day indeed when Ginger does become a city of its own. Stephen will be giving us the live updates. Don't forget, Patrick Kamara is also in Fort Portal to just give us the lay of the land, what it means for the people. But changing gears just a bit, we're joined by Damali Sali, who's a trade analyst and a trade expert, to just walk us through some of the technicalities of what COVID-19, the pandemic, subsequent lockdowns, and what that could actually mean for trade as a whole for not only Uganda, but the region. Damali, many thanks for making time to speak to us. You've heard, well, Stephen Bide is in Ginger. Trade-wise, just give me just a quick layout of what it could mean to have more decentralization of sorts vis-a-vis trade. Is there a bit of a core movement or a correlation with more decentralized making of cities, maybe away from just Kampala? Is there an implication for trade? Let me just start there.
Thank you, Arnold, for having me this morning. And yes, in fact, there is an implication for trade. It makes sense, or it's much more convenient when there is a decentralization of trade centers, so that the trade capital doesn't only have to be Kampala. We could have various centers. We could have Ginger. We could have Fort Portal. In that way, people don't have to all travel to Kampala to trade. And these are cheaper, therefore, movement and delivery of goods, and therefore trade, the country is much more competitive. So decentralization of trade centers is key. In fact, if you look at most of the developed economies, you find that a lot of cities actually have trade economies. It's not just the one capital city. If you look at all the traffic, some of the traffic, I think there are studies that indicate that 60% of the traffic that is coming to Kampala is actually just going through Kampala. So it's not necessarily needed in Kampala.
Right.
So if we had more trade centers, more trade locations, Kampala wouldn't have to be as congested as it would be. You remember in the past, Ginger was a major industrial center of Uganda, because that's where the electricity is, that's where the water is. But now we've moved all the industries to Kampala. Is that really necessary? We could still have an industrial center in Ginger where the industries and the manufacturing actually is. Everything doesn't have to be all, congested and consolidated into one location. It just makes it much more just incompetitive and much more expensive.
It's quite interesting, because looking at example of like what you're alluding to, maybe Entebbe being more administrative, Ginger being very, very industrial. When you look at Germany, you kind of see the same. Berlin being strictly administrative, Frankfurt being a business hub, Hamburg, on the other hand, having a port which is only second to Rotterdam or Amsterdam. Rotterdam, I'm sure, if I'm not mistaken. Is this the direction that we need to be taking? And again, I'm trying to think like a trade person here, because you point this out in a manner that is quite elaborate, especially when you give some stats like close to 60% of the traffic going through Kampala. Well, it's not actually destined for Kampala, it's just going through. Is this something that we need to be cognizant of when we're making our plans or trade projections for like 10-year plans, to just try and decentralize all of these things?
Yes, it is something that we definitely, as a country, have to be looking at. Decentralization helps the equal distribution of employment, actually. Because if you look at people, if you look at the graduates, say, in Ginger, having to come to Kampala for jobs, everyone is coming to Kampala for jobs, when they could actually just stay in Ginger, where they've grown up, where they know the locale, to actually get jobs. Everyone doesn't necessarily have to come to Kampala. But then also, on the other point, is congesting Kampala with everything means there's just a concentration of pollution. You're degrading the environment. You can see a lot of wetlands have been destroyed just to set up industries in and around Kampala. If we have Port Portal, we have Ginger, we have Gulu, we have industries can be set up in these areas, in these locales, especially if you look at, say, Gulu, for example. It has land, it is arable, it's now a city, it has the roads. Industries can be set up there so that the young in Gulu don't have to necessarily travel to Uganda, to Kampala to get jobs. But then also those industries can be using products or goods that are naturally produced in and around Gulu. So if we have industries that are processing simsim or grain or maize, these are all things that are produced or grown in Gulu. But they have to come to Kampala to be processed, which is, unfortunate. But if this can then be processed in Gulu, then more employment will be in Gulu. The destruction of the environment doesn't have to happen because the industries can be actually constructed on land that is suitable for such construction. There will be no destroying the wetlands, which is what we're doing if every industry wants to be constructed in Kampala. So that eco-distribution actually would increase the employment, also help with the cost and value of goods, because then you don't have to move the maize, say, from Gulu down to Kampala to a factory.
It's actually what I was going to touch on next, because if you have to transport whatever simsim that you grow maybe in Gulu and then bring it to a particular industry here in Namave or something, then that cost has to be passed down to the consumer because, well, there's fuel that had to transport the simsim. But let's move on. I was just trying to segue from Stephen Bide, who was in Jinja. Fascinating data from BOU, which indicated informal cross-border trade just north of 2 trillion Uganda shillings. It's what, 2017-2018 financial year. In light of the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent lockdown, give me a sense of what needs be done to realign our trade priorities with the informal sector, but being cognizant of a lockdown. I mean, we just saw in Jinja, people don't even have face masks.
Thank you. Actually, I think I'm so glad you talked about informal cross-border trade, because that's a group or a sector that unfortunately hasn't gotten a lot of media limelight in this pandemic. We've seen the media talk to Kasita, we've seen them talk to the private sector, we've seen them talk to the Kampala landlords who are all suffering, and we've seen them talk to the market ladies who also suffered through the pandemic. But one group that has unfortunately been ignored is the informal cross-border traders. And yet the numbers you just told us about, around $500 million worth of informal trade is not a small number. It's about almost
2.8 trillion Uganda shillings.
Yeah, Uganda shillings, 2.8 trillion. It's not a laughable number. It's a very significant number. So these informal cross-border traders actually are contributing quite a lot to the economy of Uganda. So we, in a way, we need to be able to highlight their plight and then consider policies that can help them. I saw that, but in fact, let me humanize it more. These informal cross-border traders are mostly exporting agricultural produce and beverages to our neighboring countries. Uganda, the only area where we have a trade surplus is in informal trade, where we are selling more to our neighbors than we are actually importing. It's not in formal trade. In formal trade, we have a trade deficit. So that number of 2.8 trillion is about 15% of our total exports. So this is a very important group of people. But to even further humanize it is that 70% of the people who are in informal trade are women.
Yeah.
These women, we know, studies have indicated clearly that when a woman has disposable income, she invests 60% of that disposable income back into the business. That's why their businesses are usually sustainable. They're usually small, but sustainable. And then the other 40%, she spends it on the healthcare of her children, education for her kids, and then food. Since the lockdown began back in March, these informal traders have really been affected, because you can't now cross and actually sell the stuff that you used to sell to our neighbors, because the bordering locations are the highest infection areas. So we, in complying with the COVID measures of the country, movement of people and goods across the borders has been curtailed. Even for formal trade, it's actually slower, but for informal trade, it's even worse, because it's more of a people-to-people basis. And they've been locked down for them from March to now, because even now, the borders are still not open because of the measures that have been put in place. So the impact of that closure on those women, but not only just the women, the children who they therefore take care of, is quite significant. And in a way, we need to be able to do something about it and at least highlight that plight. And I feel like it's the media's job really to also, point a light on the people who have a bigger plight. I was in Kalere last week, and Kalere is also one of the markets that was closed during the pandemic, because they weren't necessarily complying with the
social distancing.
with the
highlighted,
measures.
yeah.
So recently, KCCA opened it up. So I was in Kalere anyway last week, and I spoke to several women who had kind of also, like the informal cross-border traders, had been impacted the same way, because for them they couldn't trade at all. And when I was speaking to them, one of their biggest problems was capital. because they couldn't trade at all, that capital they had to use it for food and healthcare, and it had disappeared.
I mean, it's been 4 months.
Yes, 4 months. So even when they opened up, the biggest problem is, where do I get the money to put bananas on my stall? Even if now the stall is socially distanced and it's all wonderful and I can trade, but where do I get that money to put that capital down? Because it's now disappeared. And on average, they needed about 100,000 Uganda shillings, between 100,000 Uganda shillings and 150,000 Uganda shillings. So it's not a very significant amount of money, but it is significant to them, because without it, they actually can't start. This is a woman in Kalere in Kampala. The woman, however, I say at Bunagana or Pondwe, the borders at Elegu, may need less capital, but it's very, very important. And they can't borrow this capital from their SACCOs, because the capital for the SACCOs has also disappeared, because no one is actually paying back. So as policymakers or people who are trying to help these people who have been impacted significantly by the lockdown, I feel that informal traders, in a way, have been left on the sideline, because no one is kind of paying attention to them. And someone needs to really speak to them, and I feel like this is really the media's job, to point light in the vulnerable people who may not be, you know.
I really love that you're bringing up the Kalere example, because, again, I might digress here, but I'm just picking up from what you're saying. We listened to the finance minister, Honorable Matia Kasaija, present the budget just the other day, and he mentioned that close to $1 trillion Uganda shillings was to be allocated towards the recapitalization of Uganda Development Bank, and obviously that is meant to feed into kind of kick-starting the economy through, you know, some cheap money. You know, theoretical economics might suggest, you know, you need the cheap money for people to consume, for people to actually just pump into their businesses at a time like this. And then you bring up a perfect example, like someone in Kalere who just needs 100,000 Uganda shillings for them to buy, that's in form of capital, to just get stock, you know, to sell and just get back on their feet. Do you get the sense that as a policy measure, something like UDB's recapitalization would trickle down to someone on these border towns, or is that just rhetoric?
Well, okay, I feel the capitalization of UDB definitely is important, and it's probably going to be able to help the MSMEs who can apply for it, who know about it, who listened to Matia Kasaija saying that in fact it is there.
That's a lot of caveats. Who knew about it? Who
who can even apply for it. But imagine a woman in Kalere, she didn't even listen to that budget speech. She can't, there is no way she's going to be able to meet the requirements, the minimum requirements to even access that. I don't even know if they have 100,000 Uganda shillings that they can actually give to someone as something of a loan. But the steps that are required to access it cut out these people, because they're not people who are going to be able to go to UDB, apply, find information, listen to Matia Kasaija's budget, because they don't do that. They mostly are listening to radio and to each other. And the requirements, I don't know what the requirements are, but those requirements, I'm pretty sure that woman in Kalere or the informal cross-border trader at Elegu cannot meet them.
But then what do we do for someone at the informal cross-border trader at Elegu? How do we include them? And this for me is where I would want us to get the ties off, you know, and the fancy shirts off, and just try to I just want to pick your brain. How do we then apply whatever lessons that we could learn from maybe other countries? How do we then apply those lessons to someone like that, policy-wise? How do you include them?
I think, in a way, you know, this amount that probably has been given to UDB, which is, you know, taxpayers' money, ideally it should be helping all the taxpayers in the country and all the contributors to the country's economy, which includes the informal traders. The numbers you just spewed out, 2.8 trillion, their contribution to the economy is very significant. So the UDB should be, loan or whatever we've given to UDB should be structured in a way that everyone can access it. not just people who have TIN numbers or who have registered business should be able to access. So we should structure it in a way that we also think about the informal trader who doesn't, have any formal education, who, doesn't even know when budget speeches are given. How do we get that person? So in a way we can structure it in a way where if it's $1 billion Uganda billion, whatever amount it is, maybe 10% can be given to informal cross-border traders. They all have their, most of them do have cross-border trade associations. These cross-border associations are the ones that they are all members to, most of them are, and they are the ones that they normally put their money in. Each one puts some money in and then they lend it to this one and then to that one. Of course, these are all now, there's no capital there because no one is putting money in them. But we can structure maybe 10% of that money going to UDB should be structured in a way that it can capitalize these cross-border trade associations, and the requirements to access that should not be the same requirements that are given to MSMEs that are Kampala-based, that are, have formal structures. They even have accountants who can apply for these things.
Yeah, that's quite interesting approach, because one would argue that these unions and cooperatives of theirs, the very, very small ones, they do have a personal touch. They know that this is Damali, this is Arnold. No, these are our guys. They're always, that one sells at that stall, the other one is over there. So it would not particularly require the scrutinization of Damali walking into a bank somewhere on Kampala Road. They don't know you. They'll ask you for maybe 15 things. But that's an interesting take. Moving on, if we're to touch on the issue of some fiscal measures that maybe the government came up with to try and alleviate this particular repercussion of the pandemic, give me a sense of what you made of all of this. Again, maybe some tax relief here and there. It wasn't actually relief. Many of the taxes were just deferred. Do you feel it was enough, maybe in contrast to the rest of the region, and leading this back into the trade conversation?
Right. I think the government is in a catch-22, really. It normally gets its income from domestic taxes and international taxes, the customs taxes. Unfortunately, because of the global lockdown, our national lockdown, there's barely been any domestic production. So the domestic income that normally the government would have got has definitely reduced. I'm sure it's plummeted. I don't know the exact numbers right now. But so has also the international taxes, because we're actually importing a lot less because of the lockdown.
I heard Uganda Revenue Authority has a shortfall of about 3 trillion.
Exactly. Now, if URA is not collecting those taxes because of the lockdowns, low domestic production, it means government has less money at its disposal to operate government. And therefore it can't give necessarily a lot of tax relief. I have a feeling that's why they're deferring, where instead of saying a tax cut, because there's nothing to cut, they already don't have that much money anyway in the first place. So they deferred it. So it's a catch-22 for them. And there was, I think sometime in March, I remember Private Sector Foundation did issue some recommendations to government. It included some tax cuts and tax reliefs, but one of the key one was to do the domestic arrears, to pay the domestic arrears.
Yeah, pay us what you owe us. Yes, basically.
Because government, of course, is the biggest consumer of goods and services in the country. So they were asking, can you at least pay us so that we are liquid? So maybe that's something the government really can and should prioritize, because also if they go under, if these MSMEs, private sector actually goes bankrupt, even after the lockdown, even after COVID, it's much more harder to actually bring back up their economy. But if we go, say, we look at Kenya, okay, it's also it's a bigger economy than Uganda, of course, and but it is in the same chronic trade deficit situation that we are in. But for them in Kenya, some of the COVID economic stimulus things that they did was to reduce the VAT tax rate from 16% to 14%.
Yes, pay as you earn too was cut by, I think, 1 percentage point.
Yes.
China, no exception. Well, it's a way bigger economy, but they also cut VAT by 1 percentage point.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then Kenya also did for the MSMEs, on their turnover tax was reduced from 3% to 1%. And the big one is on corporate tax and income tax. That was reduced from 30% to 25%. Now, maybe we can try to look at Kenya and say, how can they afford this? Because they're also in a chronic trade deficit situation that we are in. They don't have savings either, but they've been able to give these tax cuts. So is that something that maybe Uganda can consider? Is that something Uganda can afford to do? Bearing in mind that the government actually, even now, doesn't have as much money as it used to when it was.
But this is where it gets interesting, Damali, because for one to enable trade, especially in a landlocked country, we have to be cognizant of the fact that we have a standing order which is in form of fuel. You know, petroleum, or the trucks that need to transport whatever it is. I mean, our train system is literally bust. Air travel is out of the world expensive. We're landlocked, so no ships. So we rely on truckers, you know, to ferry whatever material that we need. Surprisingly, the finance minister announces that we are having 150 shillings added on as a duty, as a tax, should I say, on fuel. Now, this for me would be the biggest impediment and the elephant in the room to whatever trade conversation that we would be having, because we are landlocked, we rely on trucks, and guess what? The cost of transporting whatever produce that we were thinking of transporting in the region just went up even more, because we just added 150 shillings onto whatever the existing duties that we had on fuel. 150 shillings was added onto that. Let's talk on fintech. You mentioned in a particular article that you wrote a while back for the Daily Monitor that fintech can actually be an enabler, and this has me wondering whether or not this would be a fire brigade kind of syndrome that is synonymous with the country, whereby if we're in trouble, then you know, there's a fire, then you know, we come and pour water on it. Give me a sense of whether it wouldn't be a little too late for us to actually migrate towards fintech. I mean, we had a grace period forever and we didn't do anything on it, you know, and now that we are in a real fix, wouldn't it be very hard for us to migrate and incorporate fintech and whatever policy adjustments that we might be looking at in the near term?
Thank you. I think what the COVID pandemic has shown us is that technology generally, whether it is on financial, healthcare, or education, technology is almost a basic right now. It's the same way water is, that water access and affordability is a right to every citizen. Right now, access to technology has become, COVID has shown us that technology is in fact a basic right to everyone. If you look at, if I can focus even just on education, in this entire time that our kids have been at home, they can't access schools, it is the elite who have been able to afford to get their kids an education during this period because they can afford Zoom meetings. The teachers of those schools know how to use Zoom calls. They can actually train them. So while we did universal primary education, universal secondary education to ensure that no one is left behind, COVID has shown us that actually without technology, you will leave the majority of the country behind, because it's only the elite that can afford technology right now. It's only the elite whose kids have been educated for the last 4
as we wait for the radios to be rolled out.
Exactly, yeah. As we wait for the radios. So in a way, technology, access and access to affordable technology is very, very important. In fact, it's a basic right. It's become a basic right. The COVID pandemic has shown us that. So legislation has to catch up. It's quite slow in catching up with technological advancements, but it has to catch up because now COVID has shown us that technology is a right. It has to be given to everyone. And in terms of legislation, I think they need to look at tax incentives to ensure that fintechs that are thinking through cheap ways to provide financial services to everyone that do not only provide financial services to people who can afford, the elite, but provides financial services to everyone, because it's kind of a right to really have access to financial services. So it's also a right to have access to health information and health services. And also now we find that it is a right to have access to education, but without technology, you actually can't do that. So we need to have legislation and policies in place, could include tax incentives and other, whatever has been done basically for ensuring that access to water, affordable water, clean, affordable water, is a right for every Ugandan citizen, has to be done so that access to technology, affordable technology, is a right for every Ugandan.
Damali, very briefly on that, we're actually running out of time, but very briefly on that, we have legislators who went on a few years ago and asked for doing away with papers and moving towards iPads, and now we have a pandemic. Well, these iPads, according to my knowledge, they were procured, and now we have a pandemic, and they still want to go to the parliament, yet these iPads were procured for them. Would it now be a good time for them to get onto Zoom and Skype and have, you know, sessions online and remotely? This leaves me wondering, are they cognizant of some of these issues, and or is this just politicking, you know? Because if the infrastructure is there, and we do appreciate that technology can do so much for us, do you get the sense that, or not, that our lawmakers actually know what technology does offer?
Well, I can't speak for them. But what I know is that given that now we're going to have, what are they called, scientific campaigns?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
I thought, okay, COVID has brought us to this point where we have to have scientific campaigns. And for some reason, technology has become a point of discussion, and which is a good thing, because now everyone understands, at least is going to be impacted by the lack of technology advancement in our country, by the lack of access to technology in our country, lack of affordable technology access. And you know, the legislators, of course, have to go to the general public. It's the public, it's the majority of the public that doesn't have access to technology is the same majority that actually votes. It's not, I think the elite that have access to technology rarely vote, and they're not that many anyway. So I feel that maybe the scientific elections are going to help us to highlight or bring to the fore the legislative discussion around technology access, affordable, and the fact that it's a right and it should be accessible to everyone. Maybe this is going to be a good starting point. At least from what I've seen for now is that every legislator is complaining about, you know, the digital campaigns and the technology and how they can't get to their voters. So maybe next time there's legislation around OTT, they'll be thinking twice about it and saying, you know what, if we do OTT, a poor person can't afford it, and that's my voter, and I may need to get to them.
It's quite fascinating. There's one, the Kampala deputy, I think it's Mohammed Insereko, who is a bonkers. He's always on Facebook. He's like always putting out these messages. But it's quite an interesting conversation. Damali, before I let you go, we're actually running out of time. The elephant in the room is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And, you know, we love to look at silver linings. Is this an opportunity, or is it actually a time for us to see how bad the situation is with low intra-Africa trade still hovering just below, what, 17–16%? Give me a sense of what gains can be achieved vis-a-vis intra-Africa trade. I remember the ratification and the implementation was supposed to be, what, the 1st of July?
Today.
Oh, Jesus, yes. Give me a sense of where we stand on that, and some of the troubles that we are actually seeing with the low intra-Africa trade, and what it actually presents too, before I let you go.
Thank you. So the intra-Africa trade agreement is supposed to be this opportune moment for Africa to be able to trade more with each other and increase that 15% rate to maybe the usual average of in Europe is about 60%, in Asia it's about 60%, but our rate on intra-African trade is just 15%. So we're only, of all the things all African countries are exporting or trading, only 15% of them is with their fellow continent members. So, and one of the key issues with that is because we have very high tariffs. On the other continents, Asia, Europe, they charge only 1%, 1 to 2% in tariffs against each other's goods. On the African continent, the average is about 8%, which is very high, which stops us from actually trading with each other. So the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement recommended, the number one recommendation is that we need to reduce those tariffs from the usual 8% to at least back down to around 1 to 2%, because that will help us in the movement of goods and services with each other. And unfortunately, it was supposed to start 1st July, i.e. today, and it has been delayed because of COVID again. Yeah. It's been delayed now, probably for the future in
2021 maybe.
Yeah, 2021 maybe. Yeah. So, but for me, I try to look at it both ways. It's not necessarily the Continental Free Trade Area, yes, that's a good movement, and we can look at it as something we really need to do. But there's so many things that we can do right now as a country. If I bring it back to Uganda, because, well, I'm Ugandan. If I bring it back to Uganda and take it to, say, coffee. You're drinking coffee right now, right?
Yes.
Ugandan coffee?
No, sadly.
Okay.
Yes.
That makes my point. Uganda, we've been producing coffee for the last 50 years. Our farmers allocate their land, which is a #1 factor of production, allocate their land to grow 1 tree of coffee for 3 years before it actually matures. They then harvest the coffee. Then our processors take the flesh off, and we remain with the seed. Then we export that seed. 95% of all the coffee that we export is the coffee bean, with no further value addition. And we've been doing that for the last 50 years. We are the second producer of coffee on the African continent after Ethiopia. Coffee is the second most consumed beverage in the world. And we are sending our coffee bean without further value addition. If we did add, I think last year, the value of coffee exported for Uganda, it fetched us about $500 million, around and about, I'm not very clear, but around that. Imagine if we added value to this coffee bean, how much more that money would actually be. If we actually produce coffee that you can consume, instead of you buying coffee that is actually not Ugandan when we have the best Ugandan coffee. But the saddest part to it is that when we send this coffee bean to someone else, to another country, what those countries do is, one, to process the coffee that is consumed by you after you import it back into the country, but then also they get the byproducts. One of the #1 byproduct of coffee, the pulp, after they squeeze the coffee out, it's kind of like oil. You squeeze the oil out. The byproducts, however, of the oil sector, the petrochemicals, the plastics, are just an entire sector in itself. So coffee, just give me a second. So coffee, when they squeeze the coffee out, the pulp can be turned into organic fertilizer, it can be turned into animal feeds, and we lose that entire value chain after investing our land in producing this coffee. So we could be making, actually, maybe, instead of $500 million out of coffee per year, we could be making $2 billion of coffee, if we processed it.
Fascinating insights indeed. Damali, many thanks for that. Damali Sali joining us. She is a trade analyst and walking us through what the lockdown and COVID-19 do mean for trade as a whole for Uganda and the region. Let's run over to Stephen Bide, who's joining us from Jinja. Stephen, how are you doing?
Yes, good morning once again, Arnold Segawa.